Merci, bienvenue. Merci tout le monde d'être ici.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being here. My name is René. I'm the head of the Green Party in Canada and the MP here. And I am here with my dear colleague, my true hero, Honorable Clifford Lincoln. We worked together for a few decades and also with the Green Coalition of Montreal.
President Charlie McLeod and spokesperson David Fletcher. And our topic today is biodiversity on our doorstep. We're going to start with a few words from me just to give you context, and then I'm very honored to turn the donne la parole Clifford Lincoln.
And I will give the floor to Clifford.
A hero when he was Minister of Environment in Quebec and showed up in the middle of the night when there was a toxic spill. And people in politics don't usually do that. He went on to resign from the Bourassa cabinet over language rights, became a federal Liberal member of Parliament. And in that context, I was honored when I was at Sierra Club of Canada to work with Clifford a great deal, including at the second COP 2 of the Biodiversity Convention, which was held in Jakarta, Indonesia in 1995. And at that COP, Clifford Lincoln, as head of delegation, and me as diligent little environmental activist, did our level best to convince the world that the Secretariat for the Convention for the Protection of Biological Diversity should be right here in Montreal. And that's why we're here today in Montreal. As you all know, this COP15, the presidency is China. Canada is the host. We're the host because we've been the secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity ever since we won that contest back in 1995. Nous avons fait les grandes promesses pour tout le monde.
And we took a lot of commitments and promises that we will protect biodiversity in Canada and we will also help other countries.
Again, it's just for me deja vu to hear our delegation and our minister speak in these halls at Palais de Congrès about our commitment to Indigenous sovereignty and working to protect biodiversity. Yet right here in Montreal, on the lands of Technopark federal jurisdiction and the Montreal Airport federal jurisdiction, are areas of wetland that contain highly endangered species, particularly the least bittern, the short-eared owls, and monarch butterfly habitat, which so far we are steadfast in not protecting. So, je donne la parole à Clifford Lincoln. Je pense que c'est la première conférence.
I will give the floor to my colleague. It's the first press conference that we've done in a long time. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I feel very privileged to share the stage here with my friends from the Green Coalition, but especially with Elizabeth Bay, with whom I had the pleasure to work for several years for the environmental cause. Somebody I respect from the deepest of my heart for a flawless commitment towards environment. I'm delighted to be here because I've been fighting, like Elizabeth was saying. The secretariat is located here because a few of us had done the advocacy had in 95 against all expectation, and we had won the elections against Geneva, who was the favorite city at the time. And today, the secretariat is located in Montreal. We had hoped that in order to celebrate the arrival of the hosting of COP15 in Montreal, I was hoping that we could announce a mobilizing project around biodiversity. Right next to us, 20 minutes away, right next to the airport at Montreal, we have a land, a beautiful land, which is a true example of biodiversity and a jewel that we want to preserve. And
The Airport Authority in Montreal, ADM, is refusing to budge. What they want to do with the land that is under lease to them is to develop it for commercial development. We rebuffed the first attempt. And what did they do? In a fit of pique, like spoiled children, they raised the Bollock Field, 19 hectares, 4,000 milkweed plants, which were the habitat of the visiting monarch butterfly. What a terrible environmental crime. So today, what I call on the Minister of the Environment of Canada is to someone we respect highly for his environmental credentials, to win the battle against the Minister of Transport and force ADM to alter the lease so that this area is protected for posterity. It is a battle of the public which overwhelmingly endorses this project. The city of Montreal, 26 municipalities around us, representing 4 million people against ADM. It's a question of what is more important for us, nature or concrete. And I think here we vote for nature and we call on the Minister of the Environment to protect this area for good and forever.
Merci, Clifford. C'est très profond.
Thank you, Clifford. Nature or concrete?
Yes, I'd like to draw attention to a recent pronouncement by the City of Montreal in a document called Six Concrete Actions in Favor of Biodiversity in Montreal. And in that document, it claims a leadership role among North American cities when it comes to sustainable urban development. And that includes, of course, protecting biodiversity. We're grateful to have Madame Plante as our mayor with that commitment. She's inherited a legacy of lassitude on the part of past administrations that have not gotten the job done over the 35 years in which I have been lobbying and working in an advocacy role with my partners to get the last natural spaces on Montreal Island saved. Recently, in a budget document, the PDI 2021-2030, this is a long-term budget document. In the fiche détaillée, the city admitted to the fact that Montreal is the least well endowed of cities, large North American Canadian cities, and by extension, North American cities, for the amount of natural space conserved per habitant, per population. So this has to be rectified, and in that budget documents, it commits itself to doing that. But with the constraints that municipalities have in terms of financing, it is going to have the cooperation of other levels of government, including the federal, the provincial, and of course, the corporate world as well. No better contribution could be made to Montreal achieving its objectives. 10% was given by Denis Coderre. I think we have to put that aside and move to the targets that are set internationally, even if we can't reach them. But I think, we need now to have a clear commitment on the part of the ADM, particularly to put the largest contiguous site on Montreal Island in the hands of the city and in a protected park area. The ADM has less than a sterling record when it comes to environment, in spite of the fact that it has appointed a sustainability officer, Mr. Martin Massé. You might ask him whether he has been here today and as part of COP15 and whether he's attended COP15 at all. I've looked for him and have not seen him. He needs to be questioned as to just what his sustainability objectives are and whether they include the biodiversity crisis that we're all now facing and to which cities worldwide are committing to rectifying. That's pretty much what I want to say. I do hope that we'll have a chance to elaborate further during question period. Thank you.
Merci tout le monde. Je suis maintenant disponible.
Thank you very much. We are now open to answer your questions, and you can have access to the interpretation.
Bye. I know we presented in English and French, and that may not be your own language, but please, we'd be very open to any questions about this particular issue and any larger issues related to COP15 and the plight of biodiversity globally.
Hello, my name is Elena Cox. I'm here on behalf of the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, but I actually work for Parks Canada as well. I was just wondering, in terms of local initiatives in Montreal specifically, how do you see Indigenous people helping to improve conservation methods in Montreal?
Yes, I think I can answer to that. The Green Coalition founded up in 1988, and we founded up as a coalition. That meant bringing together environmental groups, ad hoc groups that just came together to save particular spaces. And from that time, we've seen a commitment on the part of Montreal in their communities to get conservation done, to get woodlands, little pieces of woodland, sometimes very small and isolated ones. They're all important, socially as well as environmentally, and to the protection of biodiversity. We are part of that biodiversity, and we do believe that we have to make sure that the biodiversity serves the people and that the people conserve biodiversity. That's our mission. And yes, there is a growing, it's been growing through the 35 years I've been here. I've been a witness to what's happened on the ground here. And certainly, not just in Montreal, but in the surrounding region, in the CMM, people are clamoring. We now have 80 groups associated with us, and they're having a difficult time very often with municipalities that have no idea that biodiversity constitutes a necessary part of a sustainable development policy.
But I think the question in terms of the engagement of Indigenous people is central on biodiversity, even within urban areas. But there's been strong support, particularly for ensuring that essential habitat remains for endangered wildlife. I work more closely, honestly, with people in Ganasatake on the issue of toxic waste dumping on their lands, which is extraordinarily dangerous and which has proceeded despite several federal orders that the toxic waste and being dumped on Ganasatake be cleaned up. So we deal with multiple issues. We're here at the Conference on Biodiversity, but we're also looking at, in terms of Indigenous rights and sovereignty, the ability to ensure that Indigenous lands are not more vulnerable, which they are, to toxic dumping, to exposure to hazardous substances, and to what is generally categorized as environmental racism. I currently have a bill before Parliament, which has now cleared committee without amendments. It's Bill C-226, to advance environmental justice and specifically relating to Indigenous communities. It is related to biodiversity. Obviously, neither can you have a healthy human population nor healthy wildlife in areas that are being used as toxic dumping grounds. So that the issues are related. I'll stop to see. I think there was a resolution. I'm just checking which Mohawk community again voted in support of maintaining the wetlands at the Montreal airport.
That would be discussed that with Ross Montour at Kanawaki just the other day.
I may have misinterpreted your question. I perhaps missed the Indigenous communities connection. Just like to point out that one of our original directors back then, before 1990, in the Mohawk crisis, we had a member of the Ganasatake band on our board. So we had the advice from and the models being presented by the Indigenous community. And we were very supportive of that and reached out to Indigenous communities beyond the borders of our near metropolitan region. Yes, we're very supportive of that. We think it's essential, absolutely essential, that we be listening very, very closely here around the Montreal region and beyond to what the Native people are telling us and to follow their example. And we have been trying to do that.
Charlie wanted to add a few words.
Just supplementary to the question of the ADM, the Technopark area, that the government of Canada needs to find the courage to curb the ADM, to rescind or at least modify the lease with the ADM on the 155 hectares under its control. The conservation of Montreal's lost large integrated ecosystem must be ensured now. And if not, the Green Coalition is calling for either the resignation of the Aéroport de Montréal Board of Directors or that the ADM be put under a public trusteeship until such time as they can act as responsible corporate citizens. Thank you.
Just briefly, I work closely with an Algonquin First Nation in Quebec. I've done it for 30 years. And I remember seeing a statistics from the World Bank that although the indigenous populations are in direct control of only 4% of the land on the planet, their rate of conservation is 80% compared to a fraction for the industrialized nations. So the more we associate them with the cause of Mother Earth, the more we win. And I know that the Green Coalition has been working with the Mohawks of Kanawagi very closely on this project. They endorse it very strongly. And it seems to me, politically as well, they are the most wonderful allies to have.
Are there other questions?
Ms. May, congratulations on your victory. Um, we spoke to the Environment Minister and his EU counterpart this morning, who said that they were optimistic that there would be a successful resolution. I know that it's early days still in terms of the negotiations that have to go on, but I'm wondering at this point, what is your assessment of what that resolution will look like and whether or not it will be a success?
Well, I think the world hasn't heard sufficiently about what happened at 1 a.m. yesterday when the developing countries walked out over the issue of financing. The financing issue appears to me and to colleagues around the world to be the critical point on which these negotiations for a global biodiversity framework will succeed or fail. We have bad luck in timing. The negotiators for Brazil are still those appointed by Bolsonaro. Lula takes control in Brazil January 1st. We have extremely strange positioning from Macron and France to oppose the creation of a new fund for biodiversity. It's key that biodiversity in terms of these two treaties that Clifford and I saw created at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, biodiversity and climate. You can hardly hold the climate treaty up as a success since the emissions of greenhouse gases between 1992 and the treaty and now exceed the emissions between the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and when we signed the Treaty on Climate. But if you compare the intensity of the funding, the work, the effort, there's no question that the Convention on Biodiversity, now at its 15th COP, has been the poor sister to the climate negotiations. We have 7 separate funds created through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and not a single fund created for biodiversity. So, of course, the issues are linked. We are looking increasingly at the climate treaty is looking more at nature-based solutions. We look at nature-based solutions to climate crisis. Those also aid protecting biological diversity. But far too few people recognize that in the same way that we have opposition to avoiding the worst of the climate crisis coming from the fossil fuel lobby, some of those same companies oppose success on biodiversity because areas that they want to get to in the Central Democratic Republic, for places like the Okavango Delta, where Canadian oil companies want to look for oil and gas. So the issues are linked in that way. We have common goals, but we also have common enemies. And we need to have financing so that developing countries have an economic basis with which to send the large oil and gas companies and large mining interests packing, so they can protect the biodiversity in their within their national boundaries. So at this point, I'd say I'm cautiously optimistic that somehow Macron will realize that France's reputation is at stake here, that France standing as a bloc to financing isn't a good look for France. But I know that many delegations are working on trying to influence the government of France. See if there's I have 3 minutes left. Just Clifford, did you want to say anything on the conference as a whole?
No, no, no.
Okay. Okay. So that's David. I have to say, this has to succeed. We've never had this large a biodiversity COP ever since the first ones in the 90s. And this one being in Montreal, I'd say the positive sign is that from everything we can see, our minister, Stephen Guilbeault, and the Chinese presidency are working well together. There's goodwill between Canada and China at the working level here, despite all the other geopolitical stresses. But without financing, I don't see a deal. Are there any other questions? Je vais aussi présenter mon chef adjoint, parti.
I also want to present Jonathan Pegner, who's my vice director. I thought he would be around table, but I will introduce him. Jonathan Pegner comes from Quebec too, and is an expert in human rights. So,
Merci. Nous restons ici s'il y a les autres questions.
many thanks. We will remain here. If you have other questions, we can reply face to face.